Okay, good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. Uh, it will be the 20th of October when this is broadcast. Just to let people know, we're pre-recording this on the 19th in case there are any major breaking developments which occur between now and then. So you're accurate because the world is moving very, very quickly. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate from New York, and I'll be joined this evening by Jason Ross, who is one of the writers for Executive Intelligence Review, worked with LaRouche's science team, and also is the treasurer for the LaRouche organization. And the co-author of a special report on the development of Southwest Asia and Africa, which is what we're going to be discussing this evening. Now, we are in an unbelievable situation, and the two directions of the world could not be more stark. You have occurring in Beijing right now, or just concluding the 10-year anniversary of the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan. And this conference is being attended by 140 nations, largely heads of state, by thousands of people from all over the world. Billions of dollars worth of development projects are being worked out and agreed to at this meeting. And President Xi Jinping, when he opened the conference, came in with his now good friend, President Vladimir Putin of Russia. And as one person asked when Helga Zepp-LaRouche was holding her weekly discussion on world events, they said, is it really the case that you can have a meeting with 140 heads of state, which is addressed by President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, and you can't read about it in the Western press? That should really tell you something about the priorities and the world of darkness that we in the United States are living under. So Xi Jinping made the point in his opening remarks that China does well when the world is doing well, and that mankind has a common future, and that is the way we should be thinking about it. And I think people who were at this conference were very, very happy to be there. Now, on the opposite end of things, you have President Biden joined by the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, flying to Israel to pledge their full support for Israel's, looks like, annihilation of the Palestinian population in Gaza. And I can say that there is a great backlash going on around the world. There were 4,000 to 5,000 American Jews in Washington, D.C., gathering at the mall, shutting down entrances to the White House. 300 of them were arrested in the Rayburn office building. And people say, of course, the attack by the Hamas against Israelis was horrific, but does that legitimize war crimes committed by Israel, such as cutting off food, water, and electricity to 2.2 million people? The former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, went so far as to use an explicitly beast man argument, or the argument of Caligula, let them hate me, but let them fear me. He said we have to be really brutal. We have to really make them pay, even if it means, I don't know, tens of thousands of dead Palestinians, destroying any ability for the infrastructure to function, etc., because what we have to do is scare them into submission. This is a really ugly view. It's a really bestial view. It has nothing to do with mankind. I'm very heartened to see that there are so many people coming out to say this has to end. We have to come to a peaceful agreement that this must involve now the creation of a Palestinian state, as was supposed to have occurred long ago. This is in Resolution 242 from the United Nations. There's a statement of the Schiller Institute being put forward to that effect, and a petition which people can sign, which is available on the Schiller Institute website. So before I bring in my colleague Jason Ross, I would like to listen to some wise words of Lyndon LaRouche from a speech he gave in 2009, I believe it was, at the Connecticut, a college in Connecticut, on this question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I shall suggest that it is an error to talk about a Middle East policy. That is, I think, one of the reasons we have a problem with the Middle East. We keep talking about a Middle East policy. Instead of talking about a conflict in the so-called Middle East, we should talk about the Middle East in a conflict. And the conflict is largely global, especially within the context of nearby European and related civilization. This is demonstrated, especially since the British took over the Middle East, in a process which began with the development of petroleum in what is now called Kuwait by the British monarchy. And the petroleum development of for this monopoly was to change the British naval fleet from a coal-burning fleet, at least the principal capital ships, to an oil-burning fleet. And the advantage of the use of petroleum as a fuel rather than coal was a decisive margin of significance for the British in World War I. Out of that, with the breakup of the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire, came a new situation in which the British, with their puppets in France, formed what was called the Sykes-Picot Coalition, under which the entire area was intended to be carved up between France and Britain as a joint colony as such. It didn't work out that way because you had an able Turkish commander who embarrassed the British very much during the First World War, who defeated the British and the French and set up an independent Turkey, which he consolidated by proceeding to make agreements immediately with Syria in order to keep Turkey out of the Arab world, to save it from being embroiled in the Arab world, and who also made an agreement with the Soviet Union in respect to that border, and in that case created a nation state of Turkey, which, in a sense, has been a success. Not that everything has been successful, but that the existence of the state of Turkey has been a success, with all its peculiarities, which have shaped in its history. Now, if we look back on this thing and look at what the conflict in this region is, the conflict has been, since those developments of the late 19th century. This has always been an area of conflict. But people look at this thing and say, this is a conflict among this person or that person, and more recently, since the end of World War II, it's been considered a conflict between Israelis or Jews and Arabs, which is also not quite true. What we have to do is think of this area, as I said, as being an area within the world. The Middle East is a part of the world. The conflict in the Middle East is a part of a world conflict, not the other way around. But then look at it from a standpoint, again, of economics. What is important about this area, which we call today the Middle East? Why is it such a cockpit of conflict? Why has it been such a cockpit of conflict since way before anybody knew of a Jew in the Middle East? In the ancient wars among Egypt, among the Hittites, among the people of the Mesopotamia, and similar kinds of wars. Wars between the ancient system of Lebanon and its fight in the region. The wars of the 7th century BC, which involved essentially the Greeks allied with the Egyptians against Phoenicia, and the extension of Phoenicia in the Western Mediterranean being combated and controlled by another civilization there. So the conflict is ancient. Now, why this conflict? Well,
Thanks. And can we hear the second clip as well? That might take a minute to put together while Jason is pulling that up. Let me just say that in 1648, after really 100 years of horrific religious warfare, the end of the 30 Years' War, something called the Treaty of Westphalia was signed by the warring parties. And they did that because it became very clear that if this were to continue and people didn't change the way they think and change their relations with one another, that there would be no future generation that didn't know war. And this would be all consuming. Forget becoming a great musician or scientist or doing much of anything else except losing your life in bloody horror. So they worked out over 4 years a very complex agreement in one sense of debt forgiveness, many other things. But the most important was that nations agreed no more retribution, no more revenge. Horrible crimes had been committed all around, but a line was to be drawn and you were not going to look back, and that from henceforth everyone would act in the interest of the other. It is my hope that we can perhaps reach such a point without having to go through 30 years of hell right now, but that requires the goodness of the American people. And the last thing I just want to say before we go to the second segment of LaRouche's speech is I was reading an open letter that he wrote actually to the DNC back in 2003, 2004, early 2004, where he says, "For today's world at large, this inevitable collapse of that empire, that financial system, the British, this Anglo-Dutch system, poses a challenge we dare not evade. We must choose whether we will go virtually to a living hell throughout this planet in the fall of this imperial world system, or whether we shall call forth the legacy of the 1776 through 1789 American Revolution to bring forth on this planet the kind of community among respectively sovereign nation states which John Quincy Adams affirmed and which the present circumstance urgently requires." That latter task defines the pivotal, crucial, historic mission confronting the next president of the USA. I would say that is even more true today. And if the US were embodying those principles espoused by John Quincy Adams, we would have been a joyous participant in the Belt and Road Conference, which has just occurred in Beijing. So with that, go ahead to the second clip.
now, one thing is crucial about this, in all of this, which angers me greatly because I'm angered not at them, I despise them, but I'm angered at my own people who, like fools, will kill each other over things that are not really worth fighting about, when there are all other solutions to the problems, and thus making themselves the common prey in their own fighting of each other of an empire. It's like the principle of the 7 Years' War. Get the other guys to kill each other, then you come in and take over the mess. That's the way the British Empire has always operated. This was conscious too, because remember that Shelburne's advice and counsel was the model of Julian the Apostate, the Emperor Julian the Apostate. What did Julian do? which caused Shelburne to admire him so much. What he did was he abandoned Christianity. He canceled it, but not really. What he did is he put it into a kind of temple of various religions and began to play with these against each other. Now, Shelburne's conviction was, on the basis of the study of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, was that the way the British Empire should operate was the way it had operated in the 7 Years' War, and the way it was to operate in terms of the Napoleonic Wars, and so forth, was to get the fools to kill each other, to play one against the other. Now, this is easy to do. If you get people who don't understand the principle of Westphalia, the peace of 1648 Peace of Westphalia, you don't understand this. Our interest as human beings is not to kill each other or not to engage in killing each other for the purpose of trying to get power over other people. Our purpose should be to set up a system of sovereign nation states under which each group of people has, using their own language and their own culture, is self-represented. But these nations, as such, so formed, must have also a common interest in the betterment of the general condition of mankind. The only thing that's worth fighting for is to prevent evil from happening to this effort, and to promote this effort for the common aims of mankind. Because the human mind is based on creativity, and because creativity is associated with the classical poetry, the best expression of classical poetry of a language culture. In order to evoke creativity in our people, so that our people may prosper and humanity may prosper, we have to promote the welfare of the other nation as much or more than our own. Because it's by promoting in them that which is good, which is creativity, which is the development of culture, the development of a physical contribution to human effort. That's what our purpose should be. Our purpose is not to compete with each other as such. Yes, compete in another sense, but not to compete as hostile forces, but to compete in doing good and sharing the good and realizing that we must develop our people's creative powers through the age of enriching the use of language, especially as typified by poetry and music, to think. And that should be our purpose. The problem, you look at this thing in the Middle East, you say, this is a disaster. What are these two groups of people going to do with this damn warfare? They're going to destroy each other. They're going to destroy civilization by spreading this disease. What are they fighting for? To kill somebody else? To eliminate somebody else? Or they're fighting to make their own people more successful as human beings by finding ways of cooperation with people of a different religious or similar culture. The principle of Westphalia. So we get so involved with the issues of the Middle East, which we find we can never solve. The way we're playing it, we'll never solve it. We will make efforts. Maybe the United States, if it had the right president, could force a peace with the support of other nations. But without some force, there's no tendency for agreement in this region. There's a tendency for perpetual killing. And what many of us can do is try to ameliorate that thing and slow down the killing rate, to try to keep it from spreading, to get them not to do it for another day. There are no guarantees. There is a solution in principle. And the solution is end this blasted imperialist system. And understand that we, as a people, must develop our spiritual culture. That is the creative powers of mankind. To carry further the development of mankind from some brutish character by a campfire 1,000,000 years ago or so, into mankind as we desired that mankind should develop today. That's the issue. In the meantime, we will fight. We will do everything possible to try to get peace in this area because we want to stop the killing. But we're not going to tell somebody we've got a solution that is going to be accepted and is going to work. We're going to say we've got a hopeless cause and we're going to continue to fight for it. But you have to understand the problem comes not from these people, except that they're playing themselves for fools and fighting each other. They're both extremely poor. Do you know what the condition of the average Arab is in that region? Do you know what the condition of life is, the deteriorating condition of life of the Israeli? What the hell are they fighting about? Where's the benefit in the fighting? But the passions are deeply embedded. The habits are deeply embedded. We can try to impose the influence of restraints. Try to prevent these crazy Israelis from thinking about an attack on Iran, because that would be really a hellhole operation. In other words, we try to intervene through diplomacy and through other influences to moderate the tendency for self-destruction of peoples. But don't believe that there's some solution for the Israeli-Arab conflict. There is no solution in that per se. That's why I said at the beginning here, don't look at the history of the Middle East. Look at the Middle East in history, and there you find the solution.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jason, for letting us hear from Lyndon LaRouche. And why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts and also some of LaRouche's more developed proposals for that region?
Sure. Oh, thanks, Diane. You know, in thinking about the current situation, my mind went back to a presentation that LaRouche gave in spring 2003 in Germany. This was at a Schiller Institute conference that, it turned out, ended up occurring right as the Iraq War began. So as the conference opened, we learned that overnight, the US bombing of Iraq had begun. Let me read a couple of quotes from what LaRouche said at that point. He had said that the root of disaster is not leaders of the people. It is not leading institutions. It is the people themselves who bring disaster upon themselves by selecting leaders or by supporting leaders who are the agents of that disaster. That's what Greek tragedy teaches. That's what Shakespeare teaches. That's what Schiller teaches. That's truth. By studying the misleaders, the people must look inside themselves and find the error by which they became complicit in the evil work done by those leaders. He also said that we face a great threat, and if a threat is bad enough, maybe they ask themselves, what did we do wrong? As long as they blame the leaders, they will not find the answer. When they blame themselves, a cure is available, because they have to find that in themselves which led them to walk the road toward degradation. Now, a major part of that degradation today is the fact that people are very eager to assign responsibility, but not very eager to take it. When you assign responsibility for something that's already happened, your mental outlook is towards the past. These people did this, therefore I must respond. It's demanded by the past action. There is an iron law of response that requires me to act this way, not based on my own free will, not based on the future, but in response to the past. Contrast that assigning of responsibility with taking responsibility, which is inherently future-oriented, where you say, I have to figure out a path of action that will lead to a solution. I cannot be a coward and rest on the notion that my actions are justified by the past. How else could you expect me to respond? I had to do this. Look what happened. That's cowardice. That is cowardice. Real responsibility means that you have to say, what is going to be the future? What is the workable plan for going forward? And as LaRouche pointed out, there isn't one in the region. This conflict that is exploding right now and could explode far worse is not a local phenomenon. Look at it in the context of the US, of Anglo-American NATO considering Russia and China as enemies, as threats, not as potential partners, not as countries to cooperate with, but as primarily threats. We've had this escalating situation in Ukraine, where longer range missiles have already been sent to Ukraine, capable of striking deeper inside Russia. Where will this provocation lead? And in the middle of all this, and right before the Belt and Road Forum, which took place earlier this week, we had this escalation in Israel-Palestine. So LaRouche had proposed back from the 1970s an actual plan forward. And he said, let me read a quote from him here. He said that what I had proposed, so this is, I'll read two paragraphs from him. This is LaRouche speaking in Moscow at the Institute of Oriental Studies there in 1994 on a trip he made there with his wife, Helga LaRouche. LaRouche, in April 1975, in the course of a visit to Iraq for the annual Ba'ath Party session, I proposed to various Arabs who were there that they consider a new approach to the Israeli-Arab conflict. The idea was not entirely original. There were precedents in Israel for this. There were certain Arabs who had confidence in it, particularly after they discovered, in the middle of that meeting, that the Lebanese civil war had broken out. This had been a subject of some debate. At the time, I insisted it was about to break out. They said no, and when it did, we had some very serious discussions. What I proposed, and I had ready acceptance from certain circles in Israel and among some Palestinian and other Arabs, was the following thesis. I stated that the efforts to find a political solution to the Middle East conflict would not succeed under any circumstances because we had extreme bitterness which could not be settled at the political bargaining table. Before we could have a political solution, we had to have an economic self-interest by both parties in a political solution. What LaRouche had presented was what he called the oasis plan, that the common enemy that people in the area could all unite around was the desert. This is a very dry region, although it's right on the Mediterranean. What LaRouche proposed was building a sea water canal, a channel of water that would go from Gaza and to the Dead Sea, and also connecting the Dead Sea down to the Red Sea. These seawater areas could be used for navigation or for hydropower, but very crucially, he said, with nuclear power, you could have economical, large-scale desalination of water. You could open up new areas of the desert in Jordan, in Egypt, in Sinai, in the Negev, in Israel, and then in the Palestinian territories. You could dramatically expand the potential for the future. But this would only be something possible under a comprehensive, collaborative peace. That is, the self-interest of everybody for a better future requires collaboration on infrastructure that takes advantage of the most powerful principles known to humanity. In the whole region, if you look at the connection of transportation, water, and electricity in Israel, in Palestine, if you think about the proposals for building a tunnel under Gibraltar, for going from Italy to Tunisia via bridge tunnels, if you look at the expansion of connectivity across the Dardanelles in Turkey, if you think about addressing other water situations in the area, like clearing up the situation in Sudan, where Nile water is lost in a swamp by building the Jonglei Canal, which was begun but ended. If you look at the success of the projects in Libya, known as the Great Man-Made River, where underground aquifers full of water are supplying the cities on the northern Mediterranean coast of that nation, you see the potential for great projects to totally transform the region. But most crucially, I think, is that the path towards peace is clearly not going to come from, Diane, what you quoted Naftali Bennett as saying, which was that, here, let me just read another quote again. Israel's future depends not on pity from the world, but on fear in the hearts of our enemies. There's one idea that you would get peace by having your enemies terrified of you. Another way to achieve peace is by making your enemies your friends. And I think if we look at China's success in helping development projects around the world and in its diplomatic endeavors, including the increasing normalization of ties between what had been, major enemies, Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was something brokered by China. Who else in the world right now is capable of acting in a way that is to the interests of such, had been opponents or still partly opponents? So I just, the idea of a solution within the region doesn't exist. A new paradigm of security and development around the world is the only thing that achieves a lasting peace. It's right for us today to call out, to warn against, to stop what appears to be a planned massive invasion and destruction of Gaza, which would leave many, many civilians dead and make the achievement of a resolution more difficult. This is not a path forward. It's a positive one for Israel. It's not a path forward for the world. And I think our job, at least for us as Americans, is to bring the US on board a collaborative relationship in a world where our strength lies not in preventing the growth of others, but in growing together with them. I think if we achieve that change in paradigm in the United States, the potential for the US to act as a broker for peace and development in regions like the Middle East would actually become possible. And we could look forward to our own future as being one where security does not lie in fear in the hearts of our enemies, but in confidence that we have many friends.
Well, I think that's really the question. And also the thing that Americans have power over, which is to get the United States to change policy and to change its direction. And I do think that these demonstrations on the Capitol by various American Jewish peace organizations are very important because, of course, a game that's been played by pro-war groups like the Anti-Defamation League and others is that it's the same thing with Russia and Ukraine. If you say the war has to end, you're a Russian propagandist. If you say that ethnic cleansing, cutting off electricity and water are war crimes, then you're anti-Semitic. And this simply is not the case. It's just a way of using words to get people to be fearful and not stand for what is just. Also, I've been thinking a lot about this question of fear and about Friedrich Schiller, because the Rutli Oath, what is it? There's a limit to a tyrant's power. We all know the difference between being suppressed or oppressed by fear or acting of our own volition, our own free will to do something. If you are always cowering in fear, fear and rage are often quite synonymous. In fact, I think rage is usually a product of fear. Rage comes when you feel hopeless to do something. If you feel like you have power to do something, you have anger. You have anger and it's controlled in a sense, and you take action to address the grievance. Rage is not controlled. There's a reason why it's called blind rage. And it is when you feel hopeless, so that you become consumed with self-righteousness, unable to put yourselves in the shoes of somebody else, and then you lash out in irrational, unpredictable, and destructive ways. And with rage, always the one most damaged is the bearer of the rage, not the victims, who may lose their physical lives, but they haven't lost their soul. Any thoughts on that? Because obviously a kind of a terror campaign against people is not going to bring peace even in the short term.
No, and I think that people aren't even really thinking through how it would work. I mean, a lot of this is driven by, I mean, you know, Jewish people have had a hard time. So there is a justified sense of being under attack because this truly has happened many times. And clearly what the attack on Israel was a terrible action. And it's natural to become emotional about this, to become angry, to be frustrated, to be enraged, to say this we can't allow this to happen, and then to sort of be led by those feelings and by that response into a course of action that is not going to lead even possibly to a better future. I mean, there are plenty of people who would hope that the Palestinians will all just go away. You know, if we make life hard enough, will they go to Egypt and Jordan, and then and then it's all over. I'm not saying that's a majority view in Israel, but it's certainly a view that some people have, including apparently members of the Netanyahu government. But it's you have to come up with some vision of what the future could be. And I know that what seems to hinder many Israelis in this is the belief that it is impossible to achieve a peace, that either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority aren't actually interested in that, either because they don't want Israel to exist at all, or for various other political reasons of enjoying the conflict going for whatever selfish reasons some of these people have. And that's why it's not a regional issue. I mean, the only way to solve this situation really requires outside, like geographically outside thinking, in my view. So the kind of, I mean, let's just imagine that, I'm trying to picture, for example, what could be offered if we had a development paradigm overall instead of a zero growth, green, consumer oriented paradigm. If we had a productive paradigm, we would be talking about things like that LaRouche oasis plan. We would be talking about, okay, where is the development going to come from? Where are the projects that are really going to make a future possible? And what was lost in the 90s when there was a great potential for this, when Rabin was murdered, Harley Schlanger on a recent program went through a lot of this history, and I'm not gonna, try to do what he did. I could just refer people to that to have a sense of how much greater the potential had been when the idea was part of something broader of regional growth.
And also that's the United States being strong would be a great help. Bill Clinton was far from perfect, but he had a healthy distrust of the British, and his presidency made it possible for the Rabin-Arafat Oslo Accords to occur, where it's the 30-year anniversary of those accords. And both Rabin and Arafat had been fighters, had been at war against each other. But I think Rabin, well, both of them really must have had some kind of revelation, as the people who came up with the Treaty of Westphalia did, that this was no way to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, LaRouche warned at that point that if the shovels weren't in the ground immediately, if the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were allowed to prevent the funding of all of the water management and physical improvement infrastructure that was in the agreement, to prevent that from being built, that it would be drowned in blood. And unfortunately, he was proven exactly correct when Rabin was assassinated in 1995, just 2 years after the Accords, but the infrastructure wasn't built. And Rabin's expressed view was so beautiful because he talked about the whole region, Israel, Palestine, Palestinian state, or Lebanon, Jordan, as this whole region becoming a prosperous economic driver for an even greater region, which is quite a vision. And of course, that gives people something to hold on to and a reason to get along, put aside their differences and do something for the future, as you said at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a good plan. I think you should run for office, Diane.
Well, that's a great idea. I think I'll do that. I think I am doing that.
Oh, good.
I think we need more people to do that, judging from the miserable performance by the majority of our so-called elected officials.
Yes, yes. And unfortunately, among many of the what purport to be the alternatives to these elected officials. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of this really shows what, how important our activity is, how important your activity is.
Yes, and the American people, because as much as we suffer from censorship in the United States right now, you can still go in the street, you can still meet your congressman, and Americans are not exercising their rights enough. You have to make yourself heard. You have to go to your congressman. They're being bombarded by the same fake news. And since it takes a lot of money to be in the Congress, a lot of them live in kind of a bubble. They actually don't know what you think unless you go there. So I really want to encourage people to get the material on the Schiller Institute website, sign the petition, call your congressman, write to the editor, and also please don't be diverted from cutting the funding to Ukraine. I think we are close on that. There's a big brawl over that. The congressmen have gotten the message. The American people don't think we should be doing this. Biden is trying to come up with a package of $100 billion for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan to last more than a year because he wants to make sure the next election doesn't change it. Well, you should get on the phone, drive to your local congressman's office, go to Washington, tell them, no way, no way are we going to spend $100 billion starting World War III. We could use that money much more productively at home, and it'll be a lot better for the world. And I mean that. Part of the reason these things are occurring is not because the people who run Joe Biden, this Anglo-Dutch monstrosity, is powerful. They're acting this way because they're weak. And that means that's your opportunity to change history. So don't sit on the sidelines. Something that's what I'd like to say. Any closing thoughts, Jason?
I think you closed it out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me. And I hope with any luck to be able to see you all again next week.